Hello, everybody, to today's webinar. The topic of the day is contemporary diplomacy. And I'm going to present to you our speaker, Dr. David Wisner. He's the executive director of the Dukakis Center, providing over 20 years of service. And of course, he's a professor here at ACT with over 25 years under his belt, if I'm not mistaken.
26 after this year.
26. So, David, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Theo. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Wisner, and as Theodore just mentioned, I'm here to present an overview of contemporary diplomacy. This is a service that's provided by the Recruitment Office at ACT, the American College of Thessaloniki, and to give you a sense of some of the things that we do, both academically and in terms of extracurricular activities. If you're thinking of taking classes here, matriculating, working towards getting a degree, or merely you want to volunteer, you want to engage in some of the extracurricular activities we do at the Dukakis Center or with some of my other friends and colleagues here. So today I'll tell you a little bit about myself and what we do. We'll try to include a simulation, get you to work as if you're real diplomats trying to resolve a real world crisis as we go through this all. So I'm going to share a little bit of information about myself first, and that'll require that I do this. As Theodore mentioned, I teach at ACT and I direct the Dukakis Center. Dukakis Center was inaugurated by Michael Dukakis in September 1999. Dukakis was the governor of Massachusetts at the time, and in 1988, he was the Democratic nominee for President of the United States, a race that he lost to the eventual victor in the election, George H.W. Bush. Well, what I'm going to show you here is the fruit of a good deal of experience, as Theodore suggested. It's based on two things. It's based on some of my teaching at ACT. You'll see in the middle of the page the course listed as Politics 333, a course in Diplomacy and Negotiation. This is a senior seminar that we offer for students who wish to take an undergraduate degree in international relations. And we are frequently pleased to welcome students from the public universities who want to come up and take one extra course, do something that they might not be able to do in their the curriculum of their home institution. Now, furthermore, I want to say that the overview that I'm going to give you takes as its point of departure a classic book on the history of diplomacy, of diplomatic method or diplomatic relations. This is a book that was written in the middle of the 20th century by a British diplomat named Harold Nicolson. He had actually experienced the diplomatic gathering in Paris at the end of the First World War that culminated in the Treaty of Versailles and several other treaties which put a formal end to the fighting in World War I. There's a local interest in this particular diplomatic episode because it has to do with relations between Greece and Turkey. Now, okay, this is where we take our point of departure. Now, what do we study in a course on diplomacy? We study the what, the who, and the how. So we want to define what diplomacy is. That's the first thing we have to do before we try to negotiate with one another, presuming that that's in fact what diplomacy entails. We have to define what diplomacy is. And typically, we have a stereotype. We think that diplomacy is about diplomats who work in embassies, or maybe who negotiate in some organ of the United Nations, maybe the Security Council of the United Nations. In fact, if we wanted to have in English a formal definition of diplomacy, we'd probably point to one of three options. First of all, and this represents a little bit the influence of what we call the French method of the 17th and 18th centuries, when French diplomats were really the master of the craft, and everyone else in Europe or whoever else would be negotiating would emulate the French practice. Diplomacy is just another word for foreign policy. What does your government do outside its borders? Now, in an American context, we often refine this notion. We say diplomacy is what we'd call applied foreign policy. So we're not interested in deciding what the policy is going to be. That's for people in the foreign ministry. That's for people in the State Department if you're in Washington, D.C. What you do is you carry out the mission of your country overseas. Now, the final thing that we would say, or the final definition that we might look to if we're trying to understand what diplomacy is a little bit closer maybe to the stereotype that you might have in mind, and that is negotiation. What do diplomats do, actually? They negotiate. Well, in fact, that's not all that they do. In fact, that's not very much of what they do, but stereotypically, this is what we believe. Now, why is it important for us to give this brief background of the meaning of the term? Diplomacy has a certain sex appeal for young people who think about what they want to study when they go to university. It's a little bit like marketing or psychology. You say, I want to study psychology. You haven't the faintest idea what a psychologist does, what training is entailed in the degree in psychology, but it just sounds very nice. We say, I'd like to be an art historian without really understanding what art historians do. Well, typically this is a problem we encounter when we teach our seminars in diplomacy. What actually is diplomacy? Is this actually what you'd like to be doing with your time once you take a degree and start your professional life? Now, okay, so back to our pictures momentarily. And here, just to refresh your memory, this is the Embassy of the United States of America in Athens. And a good number of diplomats spend their working days in places like this, doing a variety of activities, not only negotiating, maybe representing their country to the local population, maybe protecting the interests of fellow Americans who are working or living in a country like Greece, someone like myself, maybe doing any one of a number of other types of things that a diplomat actually does professionally. Now, we often think that diplomacy, as we've suggested, is about negotiating, and there's no more famous forum in the world for such negotiation than the Security Council of the United Nations. Very few professional diplomats ever sit in the ambassador's chair in the Security Council. This is a very rare opportunity. It's a little bit like becoming the CEO for a big corporation, or like being elected president or prime minister of a country. Most people who try fail. That's just the nature of the job. But this is what we think stereotypically that diplomats do, what diplomacy is. Now, we have a guidebook, if you will, that explains what diplomats should be doing when they're in function. And this is the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, passed in the United Nations in 1961. And in several chapters, it lays out what sorts of things are appropriate for diplomats to do, what sorts of legal protections diplomats have when they're in function overseas, what kinds of things are frowned upon, what sorts of activities countries which receive diplomats might do to protect their interest here. If you will, it's a guidebook. It's a rather late addition to the literature on what diplomats do. It's a way of suggesting that diplomacy is ever evolving, and the modern forms or the modern methods of diplomacy that we experience in the 20th and 21st centuries are really rather recent inventions. If you wanted to know what a diplomat does, you go to chapter 3 of the Vienna Convention and you say to yourself, is this what I want to do? Now, more realistically, we'd like to know also who the diplomats are. Once you define diplomacy, once you have an idea of the purview of diplomats, of the rules of the trade, if you will, who are the diplomats? Who are the people who actually represent their country, represent the interests of their country, negotiate with diplomats of other countries or with the government of another country? Who are these people? If you wanted to have a quick overview of who the diplomats are, you'd go to a magnificent collection of oral histories, which has been developed by some retired American diplomats in the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training. This amounts to about 1,200 individual oral histories of retired American diplomats. Just to give you a sense of who they are, what they did to become diplomats, what they did while they were professional diplomats, what kinds of training they had, what kinds of unique experiences they had, what kind of generic picture of the professional diplomat we might be able to draw. Now, in contemporary diplomacy, it's not only the diplomats who are engaged in diplomacy. There is a kind of diplomacy in which I personally might engage. This is me, this is what I look like. I might engage with nationals from another country on an issue that animates the relations of our two countries. Let's say, for example, I live in Greece and I interact with professors at the University of Macedonia or at Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. Why, if we're trying to find a way to improve the relations between nationals of those two countries in a manner which would be beneficial to the operation of your foreign ministry and my embassy, this kind of relationship is what we sometimes call track 2 diplomacy. So lo and behold, you might not necessarily be a professional diplomat, you might not have gone through diplomatic training, but at some point in your career as a business person, as a psychologist, as a national, as an informed citizen, you may be engaging in relations with other foreigners, and this might have some diplomatic character. Now, third kind of person who gets involved in diplomacy is your average celebrity. And there are all kinds of interesting cases of prominent individuals from any given society who try, once again, to resolve the differences that may exist between two countries, or who fight for a cause. This is a famous Irish singer named Bono, and he engages on behalf of UNICEF for the rights of children in poor countries. Just as one example of what you might do when you become rich and famous, for example, after you graduate with a degree from ACT and go on and forge your career and do wonderful things, you may at some point in time realize that you have a talent and you have some capacity, perhaps you have some resources, you have a network that you might put at the disposal of some diplomatic organ to try to improve conditions and relations of peoples around the world. Now, this is just to give you an example of the kinds of people who might, in fact, be involved in diplomacy. Here we are. What do they do? Do we sit here and talk to young people? Yes, we do. We've hosted at the Dukakis Center scores of professional and retired diplomats, starting with Nicholas Burns, who at the time was the US ambassador to Greece. And it's an important part of their function that they come and they talk to the native population to try to understand what matters, let's say to the Hellenes in the room, or if you're a foreign student watching from another country, to the nationals from your country, to think what they can report back to their superiors in Washington, D.C., or whatever capital it might be, to say here is a way in which we can improve relations between our countries and actually maybe create opportunities that don't exist in that particular place. So what is it, in fact, that the diplomats do? Now, typically, we have this idea that diplomats negotiate in fancy places. And I need to be able to see where I am. Unfortunately, I'm hidden here. You would rather be surprised the kinds of food you would eat if you go as a diplomat representing your country to another country. Really very nice article in the Financial Times a couple years ago. They interviewed British diplomats to say, what was your most unusual experience? And more than half the diplomats who were interviewed indicated it was the strange and often terrible food they had to eat out of politeness, out of courtesy, to satisfy their host's desire to be hospitable. So if you have a weak stomach, then I think maybe you better start thinking about another career. Obviously, medicine is out of the role, but something else is there. Now, what else do we do? Typically, we would face a situation like this. American diplomat named Karagiannis, Alexandros Karagiannis, born in Greece, naturalized American citizen, went through the foreign service exam process and became a professional diplomat in the American Foreign Service. His first post overseas was at a consular facility in Ankara, Turkey. And this is in 1991, just after Operation Desert Storm, when the United States and several other countries under the banner of the United Nations compelled Iraq to withdraw troops, Iraqi troops, which had invaded Kuwait. In the aftermath of that military operation, the Iraqi army started to attack people within Iraq of Kurdish descent. It was kind of an ethnic war. And many of the Kurds just had to get up and leave and try to find refuge in another place. Now, you could say this is not unlike what's happened in the last several years in Syria, when people living in northern Syria were compelled, for whatever reason, by a military force, a hostile military force, to leave their homes and migrate somewhere else, into Turkey, and eventually, hopefully, into Europe. Well, this gentleman, Mr. Karagiannis, was told by his superiors in Washington, D.C., to go and aid in setting up a camp for refugees. And a good part of the work that diplomats do has to do with these kinds of crises that are far and away from the stereotypical image we have of diplomats negotiating in the United Nations. Now, where do we go from here? The role of the diplomat, most typically, as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, is to maintain peaceful relations between and among countries. Peace is sought as the norm in international relations. Now, there are all kinds of theories that we might look at when we ask ourselves, is peace really so important? Is it possible? How do we get it? What is the ideal in international relations? That matters not so much when you consider that there are certain instances in international relations when countries might be inclined to fight wars with one another. And this is the point at which diplomacy really is put to the test. Is it possible to end a conflict before a conflict begins? or is it possible to end a conflict where violence has already ensued? So those are the sorts of things that you'd be looking at if you were a student of international relations, incidentally. But this is what we're going to consider here in the remainder of our time together. Theo, I think I still have a few minutes to a nod. Okay, so we're about halfway into the presentation today. We would say to ourselves, what kind of dispute are we likely to encounter in the world today? And I think if I can find it, it's right there. No, sorry, I turned it off. Can I maybe just move this? I can move it over. Okay, great. Well, I tell you what, the most common kind of disagreement that countries throughout the world have with one another happens to do with territorial dispute, with border disputes. They say, I don't agree that our border is the border that you say it is. So what would we do if one country thought that another country wasn't honoring a border that that first country claimed was its? What would you do? Now let's imagine that the countries are two countries which perhaps you know a little bit about. Maybe one of the countries is Canada, and the other country is the United States. They have a very long land and water border that stretches from east to west. There's also a northwestern border between Canada and Alaska. What do you say? There's a dispute somewhere on that long border between the United States and Canada, and it has to do with how we draw a line on a map. At a certain point in time, one of the countries might actually threaten to invade the other, or might take action, military action, to enforce its vision of where the border lies. So this is the setting for the simulation. How are we going to deal with a real world border dispute? There are more than 150 border disputes in the world today. Interestingly enough, perhaps you're not aware of this, my state in the United States, and if I'm not mistaken, Theo's state in the United States, New York, has a border dispute with a neighboring state of Vermont. They are not in agreement about where the line should be drawn on the map. Now, New York and Vermont can't go to war with one another because they're part of a sovereign state. It would amount to civil war, which would certainly be violent and quite terrible. But let's imagine you have two sovereign states, two countries, which are recognized by other countries as having the right to decide for themselves how they govern themselves, how they relate with other countries around the world, how they conduct their domestic and foreign policy. So I'm going to open the floor for discussion, but let me say this. We're going to frame the simulation as follows. Typically, scholars of international relations who look at diplomacy would suggest that there are three phases in diplomatic negotiations. The first phase, which is the phase that will concern us immediately, is what we call pre-negotiation. This is where, among other things, you decide that you're going to sit down around the table and negotiate. Then there's the negotiation proper. Sometimes we call it around the table stage. And then there's the post-negotiation stage, which is where you follow up, maybe plan for the next meeting, where you do any number of other sorts of activities. You seek to determine whether there's compliance with whatever agreement you made. Say the Canadians have withdrawn their troops from the border, or the Americans are no longer polluting the skies over Canada or whatever the case might be? How can we judge that the things we agree to are actually happening? So we're focusing on what we call pre-negotiation. And I'm going to close this here and open the floor. We have a problem. Two countries. They don't agree on their border. What do? What's the first thing you're going to do if you represent one of those countries and you are been told by your prime minister or your president, your premier in the case of Canada, that the other guys are cheating on the border? What are you going to do? What is your country going to do to try to rectify the situation? Anyone?
Okay, let me tell everyone that they can either type into the chat directly and I will read it out, or if they prefer using their mic, they can raise their hand and I will I'll enable their mic. So let's give them a minute. David I'm from California, by the way. So
sorry, I forgot. California. So you're West Coast, I'm East Coast.
Yes, but is the U.S.-Canadian border dispute, does it have to do with an island?
There's a dispute. It's probably several places. I know that there used to be a problem between New York and Canada also.
Okay, I know
some of the border has to do, with the question of acid rain, which is a big deal when I was younger.
Right.
So
I know
there's a little bit like you have a tree with an apple and my apple falls on your property. Whose apple is it?
Whose apple is it?
Like that.
So we have
for international law.
So John, I'm going to give the floor to John. He's raised his hand.
Hello, John.
John, can you speak?
Yes. Hello, everybody.
Great.
What's the first thing you're going to do, John?
Well, I suppose whichever side I'm from, doesn't matter. The first thing I should do is try to understand the other side's claim. So their details about where the border should be. And afterwards, I'll be better informed to make my own strategy.
Okay, John, so how does it happen? You're going just to go there as a citizen of your country and you're going to ask people, where does the border lie?
No, I would organize probably a bilateral meeting with the ambassador or another official from the government.
Okay, so you just pick up the phone and you call Donald Trump and you say, hey, can you send an ambassador over and we'll talk a little bit?
Look, I'm not exactly sure how it happens, right? But you do communicate some way.
Well, let's hope you do. Let's hope. Fortunately, yes. With the exception of the French-speaking Canadians who live in Quebec, most Canadians speak in English, which is comprehensible. And Americans' English is slowly deteriorating, but we should be able to communicate with one another.
Depends on where you come from.
All right, so basically you're saying what? That you think there's a problem and they need to come and talk to you about it?
Oh, no, I'm saying that if we understand that there's a border dispute somewhere, we need to understand, like, why is there the border dispute? What is the other side claiming specifically?
Okay, so this is a pretty good start. Now, let's have anyone else on the floor who wishes to speak add their 2 cents worth. What do you think is the first thing you're going to do? Any one of you?
Maria is also raising her hand. Let's give the floor to Maria. Maria, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
hello,
we can
Maria.
hear you as well. Hello, Maria.
We will have to check any evidence there is about the borders. For example, historical books, someone else who has, and see other cases of previous.
How interesting. A historical
how they
book.
were
In other
sold.
words, a book that's pretty old. Let's see. Where was it? A book like this, which is pretty old and it would have the information you want.
Yes.
This is a historical book, right?
I guess so.
It's not that old.
1954. Okay, Maria, I'm teasing you a little bit and you'll notice, and John, this goes for you as well, when you are using language and you're talking about communicating, precision in language is at a premium. And I could tell you a story about a very good friend of mine, a senior American diplomat, who was actually born in Holland during the Second World War, became a naturalized American citizen. was a lawyer working for the State Department for a time, and then eventually transferred over to the Foreign Service. And he told a story when he was involved in a multilateral discussion that he was representing the United States among a group of diplomats, maybe in one of the organs of the United Nations. And the United States was using consistently a certain formula to express its position on a given issue. And my friend Martin one day starts his prepared remarks using another word. And the Russian diplomats, the Soviet diplomats who were there and present, and some of the other diplomats who might have been a little hostile to the interests of the United States, spent the rest of the time debating over whether the American position had changed simply because he used a different word. So precision is at a premium when you talk with one another, especially when you have enemy countries like the United States and Canada. All right, so now, to help you out a little bit, some of your ideas aren't pretty bad. You have to have a channel of communication. Would you not agree, John? What do you think? You think you have a normal channel of communication between Canada and the United States?
Well, I think between those two countries, they've got quite cordial relationship. So yeah, they do.
So let's imagine it's the Canadians who are complaining about the border, and they want to express their complaints to someone representing the United States. What do?
They could send their ambassador to a designated government official, the president.
What a great idea!
I don't
How
know.
about the undersecretary for useless business? And nobody in the State Department who's the biggest joke in Washington, D.C. So it's the kind of person that a diplomat from a third world country that doesn't matter too much to the United States is going to see. We'll take a few photos, we'll send them home. Here I am, I met this big shot in Washington, D.C., who in all actuality is a bit of a nobody. You want to be able to convey your concerns and your interests to as high an official as is possible. So in your country, if you're a Hellene, that official would be the Minister of Foreign Affairs, or eventually the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, if that's as high up the ladder as you can get. Okay? There are, if you read the Vienna Convention, there are certain kinds of protocols and official channels that you can use to express your concern. In some instances, you might even be able to pick up the phone and to speak to maybe the political affairs officer in the embassy to say, look, we're lodging a complaint. We're going to express ourselves formally in this or that way that we have a problem with the position of the other government. Okay, so the first thing you have to do is decide, in fact, whether or not you and your government want to spend political capital on this issue, which may or may not come to fruition. Now, your border dispute between Canada and the United States, Canada complains, the United States yawns. Maybe you have to decide whether it's really that important for us to bring this up at this particular time. But that's the first thing you're going to do. Is it our government's policy to complain about this border dispute? All right. Next thing you might do.
Can I ask a question here?
Yeah.
So, because it wasn't exactly clear the way it went out, would the Canadian ambassador try to speak to someone as high up the ladder in the U.S. government, or would someone from the Canadian government call the U.S. ambassador in Canada?
Both.
Both.
And you would decide a communication strategy, and you do it because it's what we call a bilateral relation. There are normal channels, people get to know one another.
Mm-hmm.
You say, I'm talking to the political affairs officer in the embassy in Ottawa, and then we're going to direct our ambassador in Washington, D.C. to speak to this particular person, right, in the State Department,
right,
to begin with.
So it would be both channels at the same time. It wouldn't.
And your foreign ministry is going to have to decide what its communication strategy is going to be,
Okay.
and whether they're willing to burn bridges or burn capital or whatever else.
Okay. Thank you, David.
Okay. Now, some countries are very good at this sort of thing. Greece generally is not as good. It's not one of the strengths of the foreign ministry to engage in this kind of, preparation of a communication strategy. Greek diplomats tend to improvise, and they do magnificently when they're really called upon to resolve a problem. But it's not the way things have operated in the past. In the United States, we tend to be a little bit too meticulous in our preparation, and maybe don't leave enough room for improvisation, for let's try to find maybe something a little bit less conventional as a way of dealing with it. Okay, so once we've decided that we're actually going to follow through, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of dispute is it? Where are we in the dispute cycle? Are we going to war? Is it merely a complaint? Is this something that's going to poison relations for the next 20, 30 years? Are we going to engage in a trade war with the United States because of their policy on this particular issue? Any number of things that you have to weigh, and you think you're engaging in diplomacy in the world today. This might be 180 different countries that you're thinking about simultaneously. And then you're a member of NATO, you're part of the Commonwealth if you're Canada. So, where does this fit? This border dispute with the United States, where does it fit in light of the rest of our foreign policy concerns? Okay, now.
I think you should also look at what the best case scenario is too. What do you have to lose? What do you have to win?
Excellent. I mean, if everything goes our way, if Greece wins the Euro, right? The football competition, everything has to be perfect. So everything is perfect. What do we want to get? What do we want to get? The United States apologizes.
Right.
Sorry. Donald Trump will get on his hands and knees and say, I'm sorry, we should have changed the border 200 years ago. Okay. Is that likely to happen? Guys, a couple more ideas here. This is for John. You want to understand how you might initiate your discussion. How about floating a trial balloon? Have some member of your government just say in a public comment, we're concerned about our relations with the United States, and we'd like to see them do something about this border issue. See what kind of press it gets in the United States. See if anyone bites on the other end. See, maybe because we have a Republican president in the White House, maybe some prominent Democrat will try to make an issue out of it. What are some of the ways in which you can judge whether the other side is willing actually to come and sit at the table? Okay. Let's imagine, John and Maria, that we have established grounds for some sort of diplomatic talks over the border between the United States and Canada. What happens next? We agree, there's a problem here. What happens next?
Well, while we wait for someone to raise their hand, I think this is where Maria's comment comes in.
Okay.
About an old book, which maybe you wouldn't look at a historical book exactly, but you might want to look at land titles from the past.
You could do that. You would certainly look to see what kinds of documentation you have, how that documentation supports whatever legal judgments your government has accepted.
You might want to see,
operate in a vacuum, and history is a very important part of the way American and Canadian legal systems operate in terms of precedent.
Yeah. I mean, maybe Americans were cultivating this land 200 years ago, or even less. So maybe, you don't have the precedent that you think you have.
Excellent, excellent. So it's not necessarily an old book, but it's some sort of documentation that you'd use to support your claim. Very good point, Maria.
Anybody else?
What do we do next? We want to actually have a diplomatic meeting. What has to happen before we can have this diplomatic meeting?
You got to get good snacks. Already.
All right, I'll give you a hand here. Okay. We've agreed that we have to talk. I'll just move this out of the way. And we have a dispute. Where are we going to meet?
Neutral
Are we
ground.
going to meet in Washington? Are we going to meet in Ottawa? Or will we meet in a third country, a city like Geneva? A neutral country. Remember when Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev met in the 1980s, start discuss what we call arms reduction. They met in Iceland. And the argument was it's a neutral country and it's halfway between the Soviet Union and the United States. So none of the two countries has an advantage. They're both guests in a third country. So guys, where do you think we're going to meet? This is the first question you have to ask. Where are we going to hold our talks? So typically, if it's the United States and Canada, you'll say we'll have one round of talks in Washington, D.C., and we'll have a second round of talks in Ottawa. And we'll go back and forth. We may also discuss our issues in meetings of the United Nations in New York, or during gatherings of organizations like the G7, of which both the United States and Canada are members. Provided there's an agreement that this is an important issue that we're going to try to resolve, first thing you're going to do is figure out where you're going to meet. Second thing you're going to figure out is who's going to go. Are you going to send Donald Trump to Ottawa?
Probably not. Well, John states that home ground could be useful, so a home court advantage. Is it worth it trying to get a home court?
United States with Canada would try to throw its weight around and say, you come to us. You know, Turkey does that with Greece quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
You try to say you have an asymmetrical relationship between two countries in terms of their projection of power. And you want to make the other countries seem like the lesser of the two powers. Now that much said, you could have a scenario like this, which is a government, I can't remember, this is Moldova, the president of Moldova who's over here, and two of his chief advisors, and a delegation from the United States, from different departments in the United States, Department of Agriculture, Department of State, Department of Commerce. There's almost certainly someone from the U.S. Embassy, so a diplomat, a ranking diplomat who's in the country already, and then some of the professional bureaucrats or some of the political figures who make up this delegation. So you have to decide, is this a thing that our Secretary of State and your Minister of Foreign Affairs are going to talk about in their next meeting? Is it that important? What is the level of the delegation? Now, if you're the weaker of the two powers, you're going to say, we want to have the prestige of a meeting with some very senior official. Let's say the Secretary of State, in this case, Mike Pompeo, if you follow American politics, or the President of the United States himself. All right, so the people who are talking with each other already about whether or not this is a problem we want to continue to discuss, have to decide where to meet, whom to send, okay? What level of delegation, as we say. Now, we said that communication is important. What is an element of communication that we use as a tool? Publicity. Do you want journalists to be observing the talks? Do you want to have some member of your delegation put an opinion article in the pages of the New York Times or Washington Post or whatever newspaper you're reading in Canada? Is it the Globe, for example? We want to show people how important these things are, to try to condition public opinion, to test out some ideas, to make clear where our government stands on this issue, what chance we have of actually winning the argument once we sit down. Now, folks, there are all kinds of other things that you think about. When do you want to meet? Well, it wouldn't make any sense for an American delegation to meet on July 4th, but what are the relevant holidays in Canada? I mean, would we have an important diplomatic meeting between Turkey and Greece on August 15th? I don't think so. So any number of things that have to do with what we call the diplomatic calendar, you have to be aware also when the next election is. Are we likely to see the United States and Canada engage in a very difficult negotiation in 2020? Chances are next to nil, for the simple reason that in November of 2020, the United States will hold a presidential election. And if somehow it looks like the president, in this case Donald Trump, is losing in his diplomatic negotiation with Canada, that may somehow cost him the election. And the same would go for whatever country you're talking about. You'd have to look very carefully at your calendar. And there are any number of other things that we call diplomatic protocol that you need to take into consideration before you can actually sit down at the table and start discussing these things in a serious fashion. This is what we call pre-negotiation. Now, final thing that you would consider at this particular point in time is, what do you hope to accomplish? Theo suggested this a moment ago. I mean, do you want a full-blown treaty that entails some obligation from both sides? Something like what we call the Dayton Peace Accords, which put an end to the civil war in Bosnia in 1995. Incidentally, interesting story about the Dayton Peace Accords. In the middle of 1995, President Clinton was worried that people were going to blame him in 1996, an election year, for the fact that the fighting in Bosnia was still going on. So he thought, what possible solution is there? Can we make a major diplomatic effort to try to stop the fighting in Bosnia, and then to take credit for the fact that we mediated a peace? And this is precisely what Bill Clinton did when he sent Richard Holbrooke as a special envoy to Bosnia to try to bring the parties in the dispute to sit at the table and to negotiate a formal end to the fighting in Bosnia. Now, if the problem between the United States and Canada is not so dire, then you don't need to sign a peace agreement. Maybe you have something else. Maybe you have an exchange of notes. Maybe you add something to a treaty that existed already. Maybe you make public statements that henceforth we're going to seek better relations. Depending on how serious the dispute is, your disagreement might be, then you have to think about the formula for your agreement. Now, in many cases in your negotiation, you don't get an agreement the first time. This was often the case in Cyprus, when the Greek and Turkish leadership of the island would sit down in a pre-scheduled meeting, talk about their differences, emerge from the meeting, speak to the press, and announce that they had agreed to meet again. Sometimes this is all you're going to get, and this is all you're going to get, and that's what you're going to have to settle for. But it's really, really pretty wise to have a sense before you start actually negotiating around the table that this is all you're likely to get in the negotiation. A couple of years ago, a good friend from the State Department was negotiating on behalf of the United States with North Korea and China in an effort to end the nuclear development program underway for some years in North Korea. And every day he'd come out after the meetings and say, well, we've agreed that we disagree, and we're going to continue our talks tomorrow, until it was no longer tenable to proceed with the negotiations, because it became pretty clear that it was not in the best interest of one of the governments, at the very least, in this case the United States, that they proceed. So they said, okay, we're pulling out of the talks now. You're welcome to continue with China or whoever else. And of course, you don't want to do that unilaterally, because then somebody else might pass some sort of an agreement or negotiate an agreement that leaves you out and makes you look bad. So there are all kinds of things that you're negotiating on the side, even as you're trying to deal with the main problem. Now, one more thing I want to say to you, and we're pretty close to shutting down, are we not, Theo?
We are, but we can pull it, if you want, we can pull it in up to 15 more minutes.
Okay, so one of the things I like to teach in my class is what we call negotiating behavior. And there are two sides to this. The first thing you think about is, what are the different approaches to negotiation and what do they entail? And how do different countries with different cultures negotiate? What do they bring to the table when they're actually sitting and trying to negotiate some sort of agreement? So in the first case, we have a classic text which we read from time to time called Getting to Yes. And you could look at it as this a very simple kind of negotiation. The case is made that any communication you have with anyone you encounter is a kind of negotiation. So let's imagine you've been working for a number of years at a company or at a store, and you think that you do a good job, and you'd like to ask the manager of the store to pay you a little bit more. You want to ask for a raise. That's a negotiation, okay? What are the sorts of things you can do to improve your chances of getting what you want and getting the other person with whom you're negotiating to agree with you? What we call getting to yes. The approach that's proposed in this text, and which is in use in a certain number of places, this sort of reflects an American approach to negotiating, is you try to find your common interests. You empathize with the other party, and you try to help them gain what they really want so that you can gain what you really want, okay? We understand that a negotiation is very rarely going to bring everyone exactly what they want. So we're prepared to accept what we call suboptimal gains. I might get 60% of what I really want, but I'm also in a better position vis-a-vis this other person because they're getting something of what they want, and our dispute is no longer so tangible, so difficult to deal with. Now, the opposite of this approach, which is called a non-zero sum approach, is a zero-sum approach or a positional approach. This is the approach that you see quite frequently taken by French diplomats, for example. A famous case where a French diplomat is negotiating in one of the bodies of the United Nations, and he said, for the first 13 hours, I negotiated the French position. For the next 15 minutes, I negotiated the French position. During our discussions, I negotiated the French position. When we voted, I voted the French position. So you decide when you go into your negotiation that it's your way or the highway. This is what we're going to negotiate. If there's an agreement, it will be my position. Quite frequently, you can look at negotiations among Palestinians and Israelis, which reflect this kind of approach, a positional approach. You don't really get to the point where you're able to agree on something. But it's a style of negotiating. That might be your strategy before you actually sit down and start negotiating. The other side of the coin, the really interesting series of publications which we study in the diplomacy class I teach at ACT, a series of publications by very senior American diplomats who look at how different countries negotiate. This series was sponsored by the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C., a federally funded think tank which observes and studies diplomacy. And they called this approach to understanding diplomacy negotiating behavior. So how do the Chinese negotiate? What sorts of baggage do they bring with them when they sit down at the table? We just suggested the French have this habit of thinking of themselves as being superior to whomever else they're sitting with. Americans tend to be deal makers. They want to cut the deal and get on to the next negotiation. I got a career to make, and then I've got to go teach at Harvard when I'm done. I don't have time to sit around the table all day. Oriental Asian cultures tend to think that the point of diplomacy is to develop relationships. You can't come to an agreement with someone that you just met yesterday. You've got to have some sense of confidence in the person you're negotiating with. And that takes a long time. Japanese diplomats tend to negotiate this way, and to a certain degree, this is part of Chinese negotiating behavior also. A little anecdote, a story that was told by Konrad Adenauer, a former chancellor of Germany, when he and some of the senior members of his government were negotiating with the Soviet Union to release German prisoners of war from the Second World War. A piece of advice went out to the German diplomats. It was advised that they have a spoonful of olive oil or cod liver oil before they started to negotiate. And this is for a very simple reason, because the Russians like to drink vodka when they negotiate, because they like to get the other guys drunk. And they find that it's easier for them to press their position if the other guy's not 100% in his right mind. And so a way of dealing with this is by coating the wall of your stomach with oil so that the alcohol in the vodka is not absorbed into the bloodstream quite so quickly. And the Germans managed extremely well because after all, it was the Soviet diplomats who got drunk. Okay, folks, I want to thank you for listening here. Hopefully that gave you something to think about. I have an email, which is drd@act.edu. You can find it on the website of the Dukakis Center of ACT. Drop me a line if you'd like to talk about diplomacy, if you'd like to think about what sorts of studies you might do at ACT, or beyond that, if you're thinking about doing a master's degree somewhere and you'd like to ask for my advice. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'd like to thank everyone as well, and I'd like to thank you, David, for hosting this webinar. At this moment, do we have 5 minutes for any questions?
If someone has question answer, I love it.
Okay, great. So everyone, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask or any comments you'd like to make, this is the time. Feel free to raise your hands. Feel free to write it in the chat.
You can see if they're raising their hands, right, Theo?
Yes.
Okay, good.
I'm monitoring everything. So while we wait, I'd like to say that Chinese negotiation, I think you can see that also in their economic dealings where they welcome haggling, you know, and I think it's for the reason you said they want to know who they have across from them, and it's a whole like procedure. It's not just in and out.
Yeah, we're in and out. We want to get the job done yesterday.
Yeah. Whereas the Chinese and I think the Indians as well.
People have a lot of problems with me here in Greece because I want to get the job done yesterday. We go to the supermarket. I don't go to the supermarket to meet and chat with all of the people working in the supermarket. I want to get my groceries and go home and do something I really want to do.
Right.
Big mistake if you were here in Greece, right, Theo?
Yeah. Well, I don't see any comments or questions. Let's hope that means they got everything. Maybe that means that they want to, send you a personal email.
Yeah, they're welcome. If you find a way to write it here, I'll write it here.
They can also follow Politis on Facebook to learn more about, you wrote it right there, yeah. They can also follow Politis on Facebook. It's the voice of the Dukakis Center. There's a lot going on there. And you've got a YouTube channel up lately.
Yeah, we have YouTube channel. We started launched a podcast where we interview some of our Greek colleagues to hear from them how they're managing during the lockdown, during the crisis, what sorts of things they're doing to make life a little bit more palatable for their fellow citizens, how they're teaching, how they're engaging, how they're living their lives. It was not an easy time for any of us.
And what's the name of that
that's
channel?
called This Day and Age. So you can find us on the Politis page, Politis Dukakis Center on YouTube.
On YouTube.
Right?
So
I don't have the URL here.
We do have a question.
Okay, great.
Do you want to take it?
Yeah, sure.
So John asks, in your opinion, what is generally the best negotiation strategy to adopt in most cases? Is there a universal strategy that's like the go-to?
Excellent question. It depends. I mean, if you're a small country like Greece, you want to imagine that you can get what you want and they can get what they want. So maybe getting to US, a non-positional or a principled approach, as is proposed by the authors of Getting to Yes, is not too bad. On the other hand, if you're dealing with intractable negotiating partners, which is often the case for Greece with its neighbors, sometimes you really have to stick to your position, because if you give up a little bit, it becomes a lot. And that, that is where the formulation of policy comes in. That is where the coordination of the communication strategy comes in. And that takes a lot of time. You have to have professionals with a lot of experience who are going to be managing all of this. The guy that we had as our ambassador of the United States to Greece in the late 1990s, Nicholas Burns, was a master at all of that. That is to say, diplomacy is about management as much as anything. Managing all the information that's coming, managing your network of contacts. You're a public figure, you're a politician, let's face it, you're a PR man. You have to manage all these aspects of contemporary diplomacy so that you advance the interests of your country. And by the way, why not advance your own career or interest as well? Nicholas Burns went on to become the Undersecretary of State for the State Department. That is, say, the number 3 position in the State Department. That's as high as a career diplomat is likely to rise in the hierarchy of the State Department. And now he's teaching at Harvard University. And who knows, if Joe Biden wins the election in 2020, Nicholas Burns might be a candidate for Secretary of State. So a guy who has the whole package of being able to manage, to negotiate, have good relations, to be firm when needed. There isn't an ideal scenario for everything, but I should think if you're willing to give up something, chances are pretty good that you'll get something in return. So the principled approach to negotiation is not a bad approach.
And especially when you're a smaller country, because let's face it, there's only a few countries in the world that can actually, take the hardcore approaches. The U.S.,
Greece is
China,
not going
Russia.
to negotiate an equitable agreement with the People's Republic of China. It's never going to happen.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like Milos and Athens.
Yeah.
So you have to decide, what you can get out of it. How much of your position are you going to put up front and will you really fight for? And what are you willing to give up? Now, this approach, John, it's a great question, by the way. This approach presupposes one thing, what they call the best approach to a non-negotiated settlement. When do you walk out of the room?
That's a
You
good
want to get a better salary from your boss. When do you walk out? After how many of times of him saying no, are you going to say, that's it, I'm going across the street, I'm going to get a job next door and they'll pay me more? I've had it talking to you.
Well, if John is going to reply, I'm just going to read a comment from Konstantinos.
Should I reply?
Yes.
Yeah, why not? Sure, please do, John.
I've got a point. Well, It really depends. You need to see why he's saying no to you. Are you not doing a good job? First of all, you need to like clarify that in your own mind. Am I certain that I'm doing the job good enough? And if I'm convinced about that, and if then I understand that it's simply like his opinion will not change whatever happens, then yes, I need to give up on my negotiation. Yes, that is the point, perhaps.
It's one of the points they raised that say you have to have some standard. So, for example, is there a way of measuring your performance against the performance of someone else? Do you know how much people, what the industry standard is for people working in my position? As a professor, for example, this is something I ask myself frequently. How much are my colleagues at another university earning? Am I really justified asking for a better salary if they're paying less money across the street? But yeah, you have to do your research, and that's very well said. So now I see Constantine has written something. You want to read that for me?
Yeah, so he says a famous Greek philosopher has said that diplomacy is the best policy. And it's a statement, it's also a question what your opinion on that is. I think it's a great way to close the webinar.
I don't think you're going to get very far without a little bit of diplomacy. You can't just walk into a room and smack people around and, you know, want to get what you want to get. You have to have a little give and take. You have to concede something. You're not always going to be number one. No, I'd be wrong. You know, there's a certain prominent politician in Washington, D.C. these days who, you know, is not interested in diplomacy. He thinks that's for weaklings. And maybe he's right. Maybe it worked for him. But I would never get to where I am. And I wouldn't be able to survive if I wasn't able to be diplomatic about certain things.
Yeah, I think we're all diplomats in our daily lives, whether we notice it or not, sometimes more and sometimes less.
Excellent question, Constantine.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and those of you that stuck with it all the way to the end. I'm taking it you enjoyed the day, and I'm taking it you're going to look for more opportunities like this. I'd like to thank you, Dr. David Wisner, for your time, for the preparation you took to put into this, and wishing everyone a good night.